Hi everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting-edge resource out there to learn how to find, maintain, and grow long-term sponsorship relationships. If you're interested in finding out more, please visit the Vaucher Analytics website at www.vaucheranalytics.com and use the navigation link at the top right hand of the screen. Okay, so today I'm back with another multi-part series, perhaps 3, but certainly 2 episodes. And the topic today is relatively grand, and I'm not afraid to use that term. And with any such topics, I think it's just easier and more digestible to break them up into parts. If, however, you don't agree and you prefer a longer format, as always, you can drop me a line with questions and comments, and you can contact the Return on Racing show using the email address contact@vaucheranalytics.com. Okay, so without any further delay, let's just jump right into it. This is the next 100 years of motorsport. What will racing look like in 2125? Or at least, what do I think it will look like then? So the first race under what we now call Formula One was held on May 13th, 1950 at Silverstone. That was just over 75 years ago. And during the 2025 season, broadcasters have repeatedly reminded viewers of the sport's milestone. I enjoy learning about motorsport history, and it always strikes me how quaint the past now looks. When Alfa Romeo won that first Grand Prix, the cars were front-engined, had no aerodynamics, they rode on narrow tires, and their steering wheels were decades away from a single button, let alone screens, microchips, or multifunction displays. If you could show those early F1 drivers a modern F1 car, they'd assume it was built by aliens. And if you're not convinced, just go look up a picture of one of those first F1 cars and look up another picture of a modern one, or just have that image in your mind. The image is absolutely striking, or at least the contrast is. So even beyond F1, imagine the participants of the first 24 hours of Le Mans in 1923 trying to comprehend a Ferrari 499P, a Peugeot 9X8, or really any prototype from today's WEC and IMSA grids. And so as this realization came to mind, the question I had was obvious. If the last 75 or 100 years turned simple race cars into machines that resemble spacecraft, what might the next 100 years bring? This episode of Return on Racing and the insight piece on which it's based take a broad, cross-disciplinary look at what motorsport could become by 2125. Not next year's regulation tweaks, not even the overhauls, not the next power unit cycle, but the long arc of change across technology, safety, accessibility, and commercial models. What might my nieces and nephews' children, or their children after that, experience at the track or see debated in the boardrooms of the sport? If any of this seems far-fetched, and I can understand how it might, take another look at a 1950s race car, or take another look at a race car from even earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, and keep this quote in mind from Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So let's start with who wants to race in 2125. Before imagining how racing will evolve, it's actually worth asking that much simpler question. Who will even want to go racing in 2125? What will be the names on the grid? Because while access to motorsport will expand in extraordinary ways, and I'll cover those later on, the highest levels of real-world competition will still be very, very expensive, because that dynamic is inherently a part of motorsport. In other words, you can control cost escalations, but you can't really stop them. Cars get faster, rules and complexity, equipment becomes more capable, and those development and decisions always end with someone having to pay for them. This means that in 2125, just as in 2025, racing will remain an investment decision, with the enormous costs weighed up against similarly lofty goals, such as prestige, marketing, technology leadership, and even national pride. Electrification, hydrogen, and whatever comes next will be mature technologies by 2125. And China will be one of their global centers of excellence. I think that's just inevitable. Just as Japanese manufacturers were once dismissed as cheap alternatives before becoming motorsport powerhouses, Chinese brands will follow the same trajectory. entering global racing, improving, winning, and ultimately using motorsport to sell millions of cars worldwide. South Korea, which came after Japan on the automotive scene, has been following this exact playbook, as Hyundai's presence across the WRC and touring cars laid the foundation for Genesis to enter endurance racing. And you can already see this playing out again for China's automakers, with Geely's Lynk & Co. recently announcing plans for both rallying and long-distance racing. By 2125, it's entirely plausible that several Chinese manufacturers will have built decades of racing lore. Rivalries, icons, heartbreaks, dynasties, just as Ferrari, Mercedes, Toyota, Honda, and increasingly Hyundai have today. So where does that leave the established brands? Well, they will still have to race, and often for their very survival. Mass market brands like Ford, Chevrolet, and of course Honda and Toyota will need motorsport to maintain visibility against hyper-competitive Chinese offerings. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday may evolve, but the underlying logic will not. Luxury and heritage brands like Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and BMW will need racing, will need it to defend their identity. If consumer cars become increasingly appliance-like in the EV age, motorsport becomes one of the last ways to differentiate on emotion, history, and cultural impact. And to me, this is yet another reason that makes Porsche's exit from the WEC as of next year even more shocking. And I know I'm bringing things back to the very immediate present here, but that's the argument I put forth. And if you want to find out more about that, I'll link to it in the show notes. But in short, any brand that is racing today will likely need to be racing in 21-25. Again, that's need. Motorsport has always been a battlefield where brands prove they deserve to exist, and that will be even more true a century from now. Those who disappear from the grid may well disappear from the market entirely, just as Plymouth, Pontiac, Saab, Duesenberg, and so many others have faded out when they no longer had a reason to belong in the automotive world. So we've covered who wants to race in 21-25, or really who will need to race. Now let's talk even more specifically about who gets to race in 21-25. It's a subtle take on the question, but you'll see where I'm going with this. If a high-end sim rig today can already deliver motion effects, laser scan tracks, dynamic weather, and VR convincing enough to make you physically brace at Eau Rouge or Sebring like I did at the recent Sim Racing Expo 2025, then by 21-25, the line between simulated driving and real driving will be barely perceptible, if it even exists at all. At that point, the idea of spending hundreds of thousands of euros a year on karting to maybe earn a shot at the bigger leagues will look like a relic of a pre-digital age. The primary gateway to racing will no longer be money. It will be repetition. Max Verstappen said as much recently on a podcast interview, and that will be linked in the show notes and the source article for this episode. But summarizing what he said basically was that this is in 2025, that sims today are extremely good, but they lack the structure of a season. So in other words, you can have a great sim, but the karting season will impose a rhythm that puts good habits into a driver, and that is what gets them to the next level. In 21-25, methods and coaching will have been around for decades to provide this structure in the context of a sim. And so the training advantage will be undeniable. The boy or girl whose family spends, call it tens of thousands of euros in today's money on a really good sim, and then goes on to spend 100,000 hours training in that really good, fully immersive sim, practicing on as close to an actual car as can be, rather than a very dynamically different car, and Verstappen says this much as well. Well, that boy or girl will arrive closer to race ready than the kid whose parents emptied their savings on karting. And in fact, the sim to track pipeline is already emerging today. There are stories out there of people going from a sim to the real life track and doing very well. And in 21-25 rather, my hypothesis is that this will be just the default. In summary, in 21-25, the sport's greatest historical inequity, access to seat time, will have collapsed. And as a side note, this is probably something I'll explore in another insight piece down the line, but this really is existential for the karting industry. If you think of all of the ecosystem that goes into supporting people that have F1 or just higher level motorsport dreams. So sim racing will become the new feeder series. Global, cheap, data-dense, meritocratic, and completely transparent about who has the cognitive and motor skills to compete, because the entire world will be competing with itself. But that equalization hides an unintended consequence. If anything can be simulated with perfect fidelity, from Group C, 70s F1, fictional anti-gravity series, even entire races that never happened, then audiences may gravitate not to real motorsport, but to the most entertaining version of simulated motorsport. Why watch a physical touring car race when a virtual Nürburgring 24 hours can deliver perfect weather, perfect camera angles, perfect racing lines, perfect commentary, zero logistics, zero downtime, and physics indistinguishable from reality? And by the way, this is in so many different contexts. Either you can have the computer race under whatever conditions you want, either you can watch pro esports players going at it, you can insert yourself in the race. Basically, this perfect simulation puts you in control. So why would you give that up? In 2125, even the broadcast itself can be simulated with synthesized commentary, adaptive telemetry overlays, custom viewpoints, or even putting the viewer in the car in a way that physical cameras never could. All you're going to have to do is describe what you want to see, and that is what you will see. In other words, the very technology that democratizes the driver ladder also threatens to cannibalize the physical product, the sport itself. Having said that, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. And this gets me to the third and final section of today's first part of this series. Racing will survive in the digital 22nd century, but almost paradoxically, with analog experiences. In 2125, anyone with a high quality rig can theoretically become a driver. That's one problem solved, I guess you could say. The next problem that will arise from this is, who is going to care? If simulations in 2125 can reproduce the sight, sound, physics, and tension of racing with perfect fidelity, then the economic pressure on physical motorsport becomes obvious and brutal. Why bother going to a real circuit when you can experience the same spectacle at home, on demand, with custom everything and no travel costs? Who knows what travel is going to look like in a century? I haven't touched on that, but it's going to cost something unless you stay home, in which case it will cost nothing. So this is the same existential challenge that, interestingly, movie theaters faced and still face when streaming became good enough, home equipment for home theaters became amazing, and it's a useful analog when we're talking about this future of motorsport in a sim-enabled paradigm. Theaters today can no longer simply tout picture or sound quality, and for years now, they have had to create an experience. This includes premium screens, social atmosphere, events, even commemorative and collectible items such as popcorn buckets. And there was a great example of that for the recent F1 movie, where examples were put together to mimic the helmets of the Apex GP team in the F1 movie. And this is all to create the feeling that your time at the theater was worth the effort and expense over and above watching something from your couch. Real motorsport will have to make a similar pivot. The track becomes a destination, not just a venue. Events will have to rely on what cannot be simulated: the physicality of the machines, the noise, the smell, the proximity, the shared tension with thousands of other fans. And I say this as if it's obvious, but it's really not, because in 2125, you're going to be able to simulate a lot and simulate it really, really well. Again, keeping in mind that VR in 2125 will probably be able to simulate this close to perfectly, racing series will have to go even farther, leaning heavily on exclusive physical in-person elements, souvenirs minted only at specific races, in-track augmented experiences, pit lane access tied to on-site attendance, maybe even deliberately withheld broadcast angles or data feeds that make being present feel meaningfully different than watching the VR stream. So you may not have quite that level of total control at home that I was mentioning earlier. Put simply, the real thing must feel like something you earn, not something you casually consume. And this creates a new imperative for teams and drivers. Loyalty will have to be earned as well. Fans can follow virtual series, fictional championships, or perfectly recreated historic seasons without ever forming an attachment to a physical team. To compete with that, teams in 21-25 will need deliberate, structured, relevance building strategies. And I've put together something that reflects exactly this. It's called the Vaucher Analytics Motorsport Relevance Pyramid, and I will link that in the show notes. So these drivers and teams will have to cultivate identities, build independent revenue lines, and engage fans before, during, and crucially, between events. In a world where the virtual product may be just as entertaining as the real ones, maybe more. The winners, commercially and culturally, will be the teams that make fans feel a sense of belonging that algorithms and simulations just cannot replicate. If teams and drivers can do this, they will create the virtuous circle that will keep real-world racing relevant in 21-25. They make the effort to earn the admiration and trust of fans, who will reward that effort with their own to show up and support them in person. So we've talked about motorsport having to step up its game to justify itself relative to virtual alternatives. But what about just having to justify its existence, period, on sustainability grounds because of that near perfect sim potential? My hypothesis is that in 21-25, racing must be 100% sustainable to be relevant. Sim racing threatens the karting industry and racing itself. We've covered that. Not only because it presents a more convenient alternative to the racetrack, but also because it leads to the question of why the racetrack and the traveling circus around it deserves to exist at all. Indeed, even if motorsport succeeds in creating compelling in-person experiences, it still faces a more fundamental challenge by 21-25, justifying itself, just very straightforwardly. Today, there are still many climate skeptics, and even among those who understand climate change, many still aren't going to curtail their habits in any serious way. Let's be clear, I want to be very clear about this. Climate change is a real thing, and whether or not you believe it, the impacts will be felt. So in a century, even though people today aren't necessarily willing to make changes to their lifestyle, even the ones who acknowledge that climate change is real, at that point in 21-25, there'll be no denying it. And so attitudes towards such types of entertainment as motorsport could be very different than they are today. If fully immersive VR or just sim racing can deliver perfect experiences at home, and if society's attitude toward carbon has hardened dramatically, then physical racing has to defend itself on environmental grounds as well as entertainment ones. The fact that the cars on track providing spectacular action are hydrogen or electric powered will seem like a cynical justification for otherwise carrying on as usual. By 21-25, the expectation won't just be carbon neutrality. That will be the baseline. The expectation will be zero emissions as a result of utilizing yet to be invented or refined technologies. And to be fair, this could just be in transportation generally. So if there's a way of moving people all across the world without emitting any carbon, then great, motorsport will benefit from that. But it's not just utilizing technologies that exist in the marketplace. There really will have to be a concerted and targeted effort from motorsport to get to that point. So they'll have to say, okay, with these technologies on the market, we can cut emissions, call it 50% just to make the numbers easy. So what is our plan then? What are the steps we're going to take to get down to that last 50 or 45% if you just want to be purely practical about it? Teams won't be allowed to fly gear around the world using fossil fuels, and even offsets will look primitive and cynical. Racing series will be required to adopt zero carbon or near zero carbon freight. Things like, and I'm going a little bit crazy here, but let's imagine the possibilities, maybe renewable powered airships, hydrogen aviation, superconducting cargo trains, modularized and containerized paddocks with no single-use components, and manufacturing that relies almost entirely on bio-derived composites and high-efficiency additive processes. If a racing series cannot prove that its environmental footprint is negligible or even net beneficial through technology transfer and or being carbon negative, or at the very least carbon zero, I guess you could say, it will be political and socially impossible to justify moving thousands of people and megatons of equipment when every single moment of the race can be recreated at home in a simulated way with perfect fidelity, at a time when the planet is suffering from past similar excesses. So we're not even talking about adding on to that in 21-25, we're talking about paying the bill due from what's going on today. In 21-25, fans, governments, and sponsors alike will ask a simple, straightforward, unforgiving question. Why should real racing still exist when the same spectacle can be provided virtually at no environmental cost? And we can talk about server footprint and cost to generate electricity. Let's assume that that is far, far more negligible than the cost of actually running the race itself. And a series that can't answer that question convincingly will vanish. That means motorsport must evolve into something closer to a self-contained, ultra-efficient traveling laboratory. And to be fair, this is what it aspires to be today, but it's still far from reaching that goal. In 21-25, the journey will, or quite frankly must, be complete. So that is where I will choose to close out the first part of what looks like it's going to be a two-part series, and I really hope you're enjoying it so far. As always, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me here on Return on Racing. And if you like these insights and you like what you're hearing today, please consider signing up for the Return on Racing newsletter. This is a short newsletter delivered periodically to your inbox, and the idea is to give you quick hits of actionable insights that you can apply directly to your motorsport operations. If you want to sign up for that, please visit VaucherAnalytics.com. The sign up form will be on the front page, and I'll also link directly to that sign up form in the show notes. As always, I want to take the time to thank you for spending your morning or afternoon or early evening here with me. And I really look forward to speaking with you again on the next episode of Return on Racing.